So today, I'm going to lead you through a consideration of sort of the boundaries of urban metabolism. And it really stems, a lot of this talk stems from a paper I did with a former PhD student, Joshua Cousins. It's a paper in Progress in Human Geography that sort of just delineates what we identified as three islands of scholarship, really, around this concept, this conceptual metaphor that is the metabolism. And I've illustrated these three ecologies, if you will, here. First, we have political ecology, or urban political ecology, with its use of metaphor to understand nature society dynamics with a particular focus on power and unevenness, often from a Marxist perspective. Eric Schwingerdow obviously plays a very big role in this school, or this ecology of urban metabolism, as you'll see. And the second is sort of the urban ecologists who have used the term metabolism since the 70s, really influenced especially by Odom's work, but have a rather tenuous relationship with this metabolism term, as you will see, but nonetheless have used it periodically. And then, of course, in industrial ecology, which really stems out of engineering and outcasts from physics, who forged sort of material flow analysis approaches to understand the metabolism of the city, stemming back from early work, as you'll see here, really in the 70s and 80s. So there's these three ecologies of metabolism. We use the theory of contemporary metaphor to understand how they use these in different ways, how these forms of islands of scholarships have evolved. And then towards the end of my talk, I will first I will argue that the metabolism concepts have become successfully imbued, so successful in fact in these three islands that they've actually, I would argue, the metaphor has become stagnant. And so to transcend this and to create useful friction, I'm arguing for a kind of a collaboration, especially between industrial ecology and political ecology. And with some colleagues, we've been exploring a formation of what I call political industrial ecology, and I'll lay out some of the tenets of that towards the end of the talk. But really, it's an exploration of epistemological and methodological pluralism to try to get these different islands of scholarship to collaborate and interact, not necessarily in a cohesive way, but to become familiar with each other and to draw on the strengths that each provides. It's the pragmatist in me that is retained and persists to try to achieve some semblance of, I don't know if I should use the word sustainability, but some sense of progress at least. So this paper basically excavated using bibliometric analysis, about 40 or 50 years of metabolism research, use bibliometric analysis to understand how these different scholarly communities signify the urban, and then to also to understand if there is interaction taking place between these scholarly communities. And then to consider what prospects and challenges there are for cross-fertilization between these communities. You'll see a rather different use of metabolism. One is a functional linear kind of metabolism, and then another, especially in political ecology, of much more of a relational hybrid sort of understanding of metabolism. And then, as I alluded to, can we deploy metabolism as a boundary object, which has a certain plasticity? Can we deploy it as a boundary object to bring some of the strengths and some of the perspectives of these different disciplines or fields of study, if you will, together? So for those that don't know, bibliometric analysis maps structures and characteristics of a subject field. This image is actually a bibliometric analysis of the academy, and you can see in the red, I've identified geography as a little bubble amongst the sea of different scholarship. What we did for this particular bibliometric analysis of metabolism, we used Web of Science and Google Scholar, and we used keywords basically. So we used metabolism plus one of the following. We used cities, urban, city, rift, social, socio-economic, society, industrial. These had to appear in either the abstract, the introduction, or the title. Through this analysis, we basically found 696 entries, and then we excluded things like public health, biology, medicine, technology. We came then to 311 articles, which we then analyzed. And we used a series of citation analyses. I won't go into detail here, in too much detail of the different citation approaches. The first is direct citations, basically where paper A will cite paper B. You can think of Google Scholar as an example of direct citation. Then there's co-citations, which provides a description of similar and related research subjects and of complementary research in the urban metabolism studies. Co-citations are used to show especially how fields and subfields evolve over time. So they're particularly helpful for that. And basically what they do is they work by linking the similarity of articles based on whether two papers are cited by a third. Okay, so if paper A and paper B are cited by paper C, then a co-citation link is established between paper A and paper B. Okay, so this is a useful way to kind of delineate fields and subfields. And finally, there's weighted direct citations. It basically combines the direct citation method with shared references or bibliographic couplings, which indicate that the more the shared references between the two papers, the more similar they are on topic. And as you'll see, what weighted direct citations often do is it allows you to even more clearly delineate fields of scholarship. Okay, so the first, and you can see these three ecologies emerging even with this direct citation network here. This map shows the results of this analysis. What I've shown here are just the top 35 most cited documents from the Web of Science and their direct citation links. And on the left, at the top, you have political ecology. You can see the very influential pieces of scholarship. We have in our midst both Jason Moore and Eric Schwingadau, who appear up here. The size of the bubbles is the number of citations. And in the center, you can see industrial ecology in blue, starting with Abel Woolman in 1965, and of course, Robert Ayres in 1969 and on through. And then at the bottom, you have urban ecology, Stuart Pickett, Nancy Graham, and others. So you can start to see the emergence of these fields through this direct citation network. The co-citation network starts to piece these out together. You can see the Marxist ecologies on the bottom, work by Eric, of course, David Harvey, Bill Cronin, Matthew Gandy, and then, of course, the metabolic rift group, John Bellamy Foster and others, Jason Moore, who are, you start to see the separation, right? And then what I've termed the Vienna School of Socio-Economic Metabolism. So this is folks at University of Vienna, especially Marina Fischer-Kowalski and others, who actually have combined in rather innovative ways some of the material mass balance methods in industrial ecology with sort of an economic historical materialism of the metabolism, drawing especially on sociologists in particular. And then up top left, you have what we might consider more the traditional industrial ecologists. And the reason I put them as traditionalists is because they are related to the Vienna School. So these communities actually do interact through the annual industrial ecology meetings. They cite each other, yet they are somewhat distinct and have rather different epistemological underpinnings. And then we have the weighted direct citations. So you can see up left, you can start to see the division and the interesting division and emergence between the, for example, the metabolic rift community, Bellamy Foster, Clark, and others, and urban political ecology. On the right here, rather separate from these other communities. So these communities are not citing each other. They're not necessarily interacting, although some scholars like Eric have critically evaluated industrial ecology to a limited degree. You can see traditional industrial ecology and the dense interactions here amongst each other. Chris Kennedy notably featured, and then of course the Vienna School at the bottom. So it's an interesting way to understand how different communities use this term metabolism, how scholarship evolves over time, and how scholarship, islands of scholarship do emerge. And they all use metaphor. And in this paper, we actually delved into the contemporary theory of metaphor to really understand how metaphor is being used in the metabolism sense. And metaphor, to my mind, is extremely powerful. And I sort of follow the argument that Hess makes, that conceptual metaphor themselves have the power to structure entire research paradigms through metaphorical redescription. Okay, and we can delve into that a little bit more. If you look at theory of metaphor, there's this principle of cross-domain mapping, where the source domain is, or the vehicle, in this case, becomes the metabolism, or what you consider to be the metabolism, and you're deploying this for your object of study, which in many cases in the urban sense would be the city. It's the target domain, right? Now, this is an extremely important concept. We basically take a body of theory or an understanding or a source domain, and we apply it to some phenomenon, right? Like the city, right? That provides a way to understand that city, if you will, that urban sense, but it also results in inevitable partiality. So we're highlighting some components of the urban and we're occluding others, right? So it provides at some sense of understanding of this phenomenon that is the urban, but on the other hand, your whatever theoretical conceptual underpinning of the metabolism that you're bringing has its costs in a sense. And so what I've done here on the left, I've identified the three kind of ecologies of urban metabolism. What I've done on the left is delineated the source or vehicle of theory, basically. So to give you an example, in traditional industrial ecology, basically it's Odum-inspired biological organism sense of metabolism, right? With a focus on inputs and outputs. Nature society tends to be rather dualistic, okay? That's deployed to the urban, and the resulting processes, or some of the limitations, is that nature is seen as a resource supply, and there's a black boxing of urban processes, and it tends to be a rather aspatial approach, right? Very much a focus on inputs and outputs of things. In urban political ecology, you have a theorization of the metabolism as hybridized nature-society relations. It's very relational, heavily influenced by Marxist theory. And one could argue that there are limitations associated with that, or they have evolved in practice through publication to often emphasize the social at the expense of the ecological processes. Interesting that there's a theoretical conception often emerging, for example, as planetary urbanization. But in practice, when you get to empirical studies, I would argue that you have a methodological cityism, and others have made this argument as well, that there is a focus, even though you're theorizing these interconnections between the urban and the elsewhere, you have a focus, often for practical reasons, of the city as a place-based experience or object of study. So it's an interesting tension. There is work on planetary urbanization that is seeking to transcend this to some degree, but you still have a prevalence of methodological cityism in much urban political ecology metabolism research. And it's also primarily qualitative. In urban ecology, you have complex ecosystems theory and models, which really informs the sense of metabolism. And one could argue that you celebrate complexity at the expense of distal flows, somewhat related to the methodological cityism that predominates in urban political ecology. This is just a table from the paper that I mentioned in Progress in Human Geography, where we identify sort of we delineate these islands of urban metabolism in a little bit more detail. It might be of interest to you. Some of the emphases, the language that's used, the methods and the models that are deployed, and the limitations, which I highlighted in the previous slide, but they're here in a little bit more detail. I won't go into this in much detail, but if you're interested, we can talk about these delineations later. Interesting critique. So I'm going to focus a little bit on the critique of industrial ecology, basically by political ecologists, and the most famous is Eric's work, actually, that I found the most, and rather limited, I would say, that Eric is among few who have really tried to look critically at industrial ecology work. He has a quote that I often use in work. Studies of metabolism have often uncritically pursued the standard industrial ecology perspective based on some input-output model of the flow of things. Such analysis merely poses the issue and fails to theorize the making of the urban as a socio-environmental metabolism. And he provides this rather dry, boring table of the metabolism of Greater London to make this clear. If you look at urban political ecology, critique of industrial ecology, sorry, we're still on urban political ecology, critique of industrial ecology. So the critique is really that it's a method without theoretical apparatus. That, at least, is what I would center as the urban political ecology, critique of industrial ecology. It's essentially critical of the assumed logical positivism that undergirds the input-output model and the reductionist approach to the city. So I think there is a theoretical apparatus, in fact, but it's very much a logical positivist sort of approach. And what really, and part of this critique, I think, leads to is that we're looking at competing theorizations of the city, right, are at stake. And it's based on the argument that relational notions of urban metabolism, and Gandhi makes this point in his work as well, are now more appropriate than the functional linear neo-organismic ones and the technocratic urban models that they generate, right? So we're looking at very different understandings of the metabolism and the theory that undergirds it. I would say that industrial ecology doesn't have an explicit epistemological stance, but it's very implicit and very much connected to a logical positivist approach. And there's an applied alignment as well with sort of a naive form of ecological modernization as well. If you look at the urban ecology critique of traditional industrial ecology, the most sort of engaged critique has been by Nancy Golubeski, and really is considering this city as an ecosystem versus an organismic metabolism. And she faults a lot of the industrial ecology work by taking a very simplistic sort of appropriation of odom, and that this organismic metabolism metaphor actually obscures processes within the city, and that the ecosystem metabolism is a better metaphor for the city because it's attentive to the hybrid phenomena that emerge between interactions between human and ecological processes. Right, a much more interesting, I think that her argument is rather more similar to political ecology as well, which is much more of a focus on relational hybrid conceptions of metabolism, which gives me hope for some potential interaction but actually between urban ecology and political ecology because of this. Nonetheless, all of these basic approaches result in a partiality. And in the case of urban ecology, it's a partiality that privileges the urban ecosystem complexity, as I mentioned earlier, at the expense of the more unbounded flows coursing through the city. So what you can see here is that particular epistemological framings at once give power to the term urban metabolism, right? They're what give it its force, its generative power, but they also the shackle of the metaphor through the disciplining process. So we can consider, okay, why are these scholarly islands emerging? Is it merely because of epistemology? Certainly, as you've seen, there are epistemological differences in terms of how nature-society relations are theorized, the degree of critical focus. But if you think about it, the rift sociologists, as I showed in that weighted direct citation, and the urban political ecologists are isolated metabolism theorists despite very close shared roots, particularly with their Marxist underpinnings. So I'd argue it's not just epistemology, it extends beyond it, ranging from the object and method to disciplinary bound reward structures of the academy. And this is a process of exclusion that forms over time, and it stems from knowledge production in disciplinary clusters, as Erica Schoenberger makes the case. So we're looking beyond epistemology to the practice of the academy, right, and that formation. So if we were to think about how to reinvigorate the urban metabolism metaphor, I have argued in this paper with Josh that the metaphor has become stagnant, rather stagnant in the three disciplines. The partiality of metaphor has become canonized through habitual use and become aligned with a particular topical or epistemological position. Urbanism, however, is complex, adaptive, multiscalar, and my argument is that we do need an interdisciplinary approach. It's the pragmatist in me again arising. I just borrowed a figure from our paper on urban resilience, which provides one sort of image of what the urban form and flow might look like. And you can see it's very complex if we try to consider, material and energy flows, along with governance networks, along with socioeconomic dynamics, along with infrastructure and form over time and space. So that my argument is that we actually need all the disciplines or multiple disciplines to collaborate, at least on some scale. So we propose urban metabolism as a boundary object or a boundary metaphor to more fully theorize, model, and transform urban space. It too, as a boundary object, can inhabit multiple disciplinary worlds where the concept is interpreted differently in each one. And this, as Anna Singh notes on friction, it enables a process of empirical friction, experienced collectively, one that pushes the boundaries of epistemological and methodological pluralism. A rather grand experiment of friction between these often very different disciplines to see what can arise. Metabolism as a boundary object. I like this idea because boundary objects are concepts or items that have a malleability or a plasticity so that they inhabit multiple social worlds simultaneously while meeting the demands of each one. And I think that urban metabolism can be interpreted this way, as it too inhabits multiple social worlds where the concept is interpreted differently in each one. So metabolism is at once plastic enough to adapt to local needs and the constraints of several parties employing them, such as individual disciplinary cultures, yet robust enough to maintain some sort of common identity across empirical sites. And one of the things that we did in this paper, and there's a follow-up paper if you're interested, on water as a boundary object of the urban metabolism. As Gandhi argues, the history of cities can actually be read as a history of water, which is a very interesting way to think about it. I won't go into detail about why, but what we did with our study is we looked at the water supply network of Los Angeles. I like water because it's more spatially bounded than many of the other flows, for instance, energy, which is often global. It's also the most well-studied flow in urban political ecology, the work on the hydrosocial cycle. It provides a concrete set of hydrological processes for ecologists to engage. And there's a lot of urban-rural interactions, also called telecoupling, teleconnections. In economic geography, you have the notion of relationality and territoriality. So it's an interesting dynamic and interesting resource as an object of study. And what we did is we combined sort of approaches in political ecology and industrial ecology to study the water supply of Los Angeles in our paper. And what we did is we basically combined these two approaches to we argue, to more fully understand the urban water supply metabolism. We infuse spatiality into industrial ecology method, in particular life cycle assessment, using GIS and downscaling to critique and advance LCA at one point by basically evaluating conventional methods to quantify the emissions footprint of water supply. And then we use political ecology theory approaches, interviews, historical analysis, and basic conceptual frames to consider the sustainability and equity dimensions beyond the sort of tyrannical carbon footprint approach of water source estimates. And what we've done since then is actually try to develop this idea of political industrial ecology. And we came out with a special issue in Geoforum where we tried to provide some basic definition of political industrial ecology. And I could read sections of it here. Basically, it's a confluence between two thought traditions, political ecology and industrial ecology. And it focuses specifically on the ways in which resource flows and stocks shape and are shaped by environmental, socio-economic, and political processes and patterns over time and space. So as part of a broader rebalancing of nature-society relations, political industrial ecology, or PI, is committed to situating resource extraction, transformation, and consumption within their social and political economic context. It concludes a commitment to altering, reducing, or transforming these stocks and flows as guided by principles of equity and justice. It embraces pluralism, both epistemological and methodological, and that it celebrates friction. between these different fields, these different epistemologies, which can, we argue, yield unexpected and potentially transformative understandings and approaches. This friction is made apparent by a dialectical and quasi-fusion between respective qualitative and quantitative methodologies found in both fields, including modeling of resource flow and form, historical materialism, ethnography, and more. And so each field can really contribute to each other. In industrial ecology, I've made repeated attempts to try to infuse political ecology into it, encouraging a deeper consideration of political economy, including capital flows and governance and equality, and a deeper engagement with spatial theory as well from geography, spatial analyses, concepts of scale, and so on. And then in political ecology, I think there's a great opportunity to infuse some mass balance methodologies, basically life cycle assessment, material flow analysis, cradle to cradle thinking, to more deeply engage with material production consumption dynamics in political ecology. This just shows some of the cross-fertilization potential I've already alluded to, seeing a little bit differently. I didn't talk much about urban ecology, but there's a lot of interesting complex systems theory around socio-ecological systems that I think can interface, especially with potentially political ecology. This is the 7 articles in that special issue on political ecology that I mentioned. Some interesting people here that might be familiar to folks. Matthew Huber, Luke Bergman, and others. Some interesting case studies kind of trying to meld these two approaches, and some of which engage the metabolism directly, especially the piece that Vanessa Castambrotto was involved with, and Joshua Cousins as well, really engaging with metabolism as a resource concept in particular, which may be of interest to this group. Thank you.